to join. We're now streaming on YouTube, so that's another way that folks can watch this. Hi, everyone. We'll get started in another minute or so. Okay, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the CGD seminar this morning. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Hilary Scannell from Columbia University as our speaker today. Dr. Scannell is a postdoctoral research scientist in the Climate Data Science Lab, which is part of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia. She received her bachelor's in marine science and her master's in oceanography, both from the University of Maine, and her PhD in oceanography from the University of Washington in 2020. Her dissertation focused on the spatiotemporal evolution of marine heat waves globally, and also worked on developing a novel tracking algorithm to characterize dangerous marine heat waves. During her PhD, she was a graduate research assistant at the NOAA Pacific Marine Environmental Lab, and also an ASP graduate fellow here at NCAR, mostly visiting CISL, and happened to visit the Mesa Lab right before everything shut down last spring. Hilary is interested in human impacts at the crossroads of the information age and the Anthropocene. Her research on complex spatiotemporal variability of geophysical fluids and their impacts leverages and innovates new data-driven technologies to address modern environmental challenges. Today, she will speak about new insights into the spatiotemporal connectivity of marine heat waves globally. Hilary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katie. Let's share my screen. Okie doke. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen and can hear me.
Looks great.
All right, so hi everyone. Thanks for joining and the invitation to speak today. I first want to acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators. So Luann Thompson, she was actually my PhD advisor, David John Gagne, who's at CISL, and then Dan Witt, who was at CGD, now is at NASA. And this work, as Katie mentioned, was started about a year ago when I was a graduate visitor during the advanced study program. And so I was at the Mesa lab about 2 weeks before it all shut down due to COVID. And I feel very fortunate that I was able to continue this work, this exciting project, remotely and present it to you today. So let's begin here. There we go. All right, so yes, the talk is on marine heat waves, and very qualitatively, you can describe a marine heat wave as this prolonged, discrete, so it has a start and an end date, and anomalous warm water event. And this is really a remarkable image. This is of the sea surface temperature anomaly in May 2015. And most of you will recognize this image as the blob. And so the blob took us by storm essentially in 2013, and it persisted for multiple years through at least 2015, even into 2016. And this was such an extraordinary event because it really put marine heat waves on the radar of a lot of US scientists. So this wasn't the first marine heat wave ever described or recorded, but it certainly was a very important event for its impacts on the marine ecosystem. And so some of those impacts, of course, you have this warm water blob, which can reduce the productivity of the marine ecosystem in this region. And so with a reduction in productivity, that means that there's less food available for animals like sea lions, seabirds to survive. And so what was happening, we saw a lot of stranded sea lion pups along the beach. And, there was a mass die-off of common mures like the one shown here that washed ashore because it couldn't find food that it needed to survive. Another thing that this warm mass of water brought was a type of algae called Pseudonychia australis. And this is a very dangerous algae under the right environmental conditions, as it can produce a potent neurotoxin called domoic acid. And so when this algae is ingested by, these animals, it can cause paralytic shellfish poisoning. And the fear is that this algae can accumulate in bivalves, which people harvest and can harm people. So as a result of this marine heat wave, a lot of the clamming fisheries were closed for an extended period of time on the West Coast. And so that also led to economic losses. And so this kind of drives home why this particular event was so important to understand and really captured a lot of attention, especially from the media when you're walking the beach and you kind of see this response in the ecosystem. So again, that's a picture kind of the media likes to paint and hold on to, but as scientists, we want to be able to identify, describe, and eventually predict these marine heat waves. And so I'm going to walk through how we define them. And it's a very simplistic walkthrough, so sorry if this is a little boring to you. But we'll start with just picking out a point in the Northeast Pacific. So I'm using the NOAA Optimum Interpolation Sea Surface Temperature Dataset. So this is a blend of in situ observations interpolated to a grid. And here I'm showing you the time series that's available. So about late 1981 through 2020. So you have this really nice seasonal cycle. You have interannual variability. Let's just zoom in on this 5-year period. This is when the blob, that marine heat wave in the Pacific occurred. And so we're going to look at this section of time to describe how we define a marine heat wave. So the first thing we do once we have this data set, we want to fit the mean, the seasonal cycle, and the trend to it. So that's what I'm showing here by this orange time series. And so this orange time series is what we would expect the temperatures to be like according to this 40-year averaging period. And then you can see that there was periods where the temperature was above this orange line, and so those are times when it was warm. So we can subtract the temperature from that fitted reference of the seasonal cycle, the trend, and the mean to get anomalies. And it's not surprising that this 5-year period was warmer than average. That's when we had that marine heat wave. But not all of those positive temperature anomalies are considered a marine heat wave. So we have different thresholds we use to determine at what point that a marine heat wave occurs. And the most common threshold that is used is looking at a percentile-based metric. And so the 90th percentile is one that is often referred to. So I'll show that here as this thick dashed line. And so when the temperature anomaly exceeds that, it's considered a marine heat wave. Now you can also increase that threshold, say the 95th or the 99th, and you'll see that those marine heat waves, become less common because they're not surpassing that high threshold as frequently. Now, of course, you can do this on daily data as well. In fact, that's more preferred. And with daily data, you might introduce a minimum duration criteria. So what's often used is a 5-day minimum with no more than a 2-day gap. Because I'm showing a simple monthly time series, my minimum duration is just a month. So what can we say about marine heat waves from this type of analysis? Well, we have a few different metrics that we can compute. These are probably very familiar to all of you. The first one is a duration. So the duration is the time period from when the event started, from its initiation to when it terminated. And over that duration, you can find at what point the maximum intensity was. You can calculate the mean intensity. You can even calculate a cumulative intensity where you're summing up the anomalies over the duration of that event. Okay, another metric that's really helpful to think about is frequency. So this is kind of a count of the number of marine heat waves in a certain period of time. Other additional measures include the rate of onset and decline. So this is as simple as connecting a line through 2 points between the onset and the max intensity, and then calculating that slope as the rate of onset. The rate of decline then is just the slope between the max intensity to the termination. And then if you do this over an area, you can then calculate the spatial extent. And that's what I did during my master's, which is referenced down here in the middle. Okay, and then there's another proposed way of classifying marine heat waves, and that is assigning them a category. So these categories are determined by multiples of the 90th percentile difference. So for example, if the sea surface temperature exceeds that threshold by 2 multiples, it would be a category 2 marine heat wave, and so on. And so you have categories 1 through 4, and this is a nice way to distinguish the different severities of marine heat wave events, to categorize them, and then also it helps in communicating what type of marine heat wave we're looking at. So this type of analysis where you're computing these metrics at each single grid point is fairly common and gives you a nice picture of what the spatial distribution looks like around the globe. So I'm showing you a series of maps now. On the left, this is and these maps are calculated by doing exactly the method I showed earlier, where at each grid point, they're calculating, okay, what's the frequency in this point? What's the intensity? What's the average duration? And so those maps on the left are showing you the annual, so these are marine heat wave days now. So number of marine heat wave days per year. So you can see that there's more marine heat waves in the central equatorial, eastern equatorial Pacific, and more at high latitudes. The middle plot on the left is now the average marine heat wave intensity. And the bottom is the average marine heat wave duration. And these patterns look quite familiar. So if you're looking at SST variability, so panel E over here, you can see that that looks a lot like the marine heat wave intensity. And so in the bottom panel, the duration maps pretty well onto the memory time scale of SSTs in the ocean. And so because we're defining marine heat waves from this variability in the sea surface temperature, it's not surprising that these patterns come out to you. All right, so so this is a nice way to kind of look at discrete events that have occurred. And so here is a composite image. So they're averaging the marine heat wave anomalies for different events. And they're finding these events by taking the average sea surface temperature anomaly in each of these gridded boxes. And so they're finding when that temperature, the anomaly time series is max, and then they're grabbing the spatial field in that area. So essentially, this is just a snapshot of several different marine heat waves that have occurred in the 21st century that had impacts and were well described. And so you can see that a lot of them tend to be coastal, and they're quite large. So this kind of gives you a sense of the scale of these events and their locations. Okay, so I wanted to ask, what does this characterization miss? Looking at, a single point and drawing out these marine heat wave statistics. And one way to kind of draw you towards that answer is to examine this animation showing the marine heat wave anomalies evolving over this 5-year period, where this X is the point of that time series I showed earlier, where we were looking at the marine heat wave statistics. And so what you see is that, okay, so you see El Nino, obviously, but these really warm blobs of marine heat waves don't just stay in one place. They are moving around. They're passing through that point and they're leaving. And so if you're just looking at a single point or a fixed boxed average region, you might be missing part of the story. So these marine heat waves, they move throughout the ocean. And why do they move? Well, it's due to their forcing. So it's either air-sea heat fluxes causing that warming to evolve, ocean heat transport, and or the influence of remote teleconnections. And so now I want to turn the discussion over to the drivers of marine heat waves to understand how they are moving around the ocean. And this is a schematic that I worked with Neil Holbrook from the University of Tasmania to produce. And so we combed through, hundreds of papers to kind of look through just to find what the drivers of marine heat waves are and then map them onto both their time scale and their spatial scale. And so this is what we found. This is kind of a broad generalization of what drives marine heat waves, everything from the smaller scale process level to the large scale climate drivers. This talk, I'm kind of avoiding or ignoring the long-term climate change warming signal. That's a different talk. But I just want to now focus in on some of these different scales. So down in the lower left corner, these are local processes that affects the mixed layer temperature heat budget. And the heat budget is a very common tool that we use to look at the drivers of marine heat waves. So let's look at what the heat budget is. I'm sure most of you are very well familiar of this, but for those who aren't, you have the temperature within the mixed layer is controlled by a number of processes. The first is likely horizontal advection. So heat coming in or out of this mixed layer volume. You have horizontal mixing, whether that's mesoscale, and then you have vertical mixing within the base of the mixed layer up into the and the upper layer. And entrainment, you have surface heat fluxes from the atmosphere. So these are both turbulent and radiative heat fluxes that then are mixed within that upper layer. And the migration of the base of the mixed layer can also influence the rate of temperature change that occurs. Okay, so let's look at some studies that have used heat budgets to diagnose the drivers of marine heat waves in particular locations. So here's a study done by Eric Oliver and his co-authors where they fix a box in the Tasman Sea with a fixed depth mixed layer during a marine heat wave. And so what they're doing is a integrated heat budget from the point of when the marine heat wave starts. And so on the bottom, you have that temperature tendency integrated from September 2015 through April 2016. And the total temperature tendency is shown in the black line. So it's warming. There's a marine heat wave, so it's warming. And that warming is almost completely balanced by the advective component. And so they concluded that this marine heat wave is really driven by an unusual poleward extension of the EAC. Okay, so another nice study by Dylan and Maya used another heat budget in the North Pacific to look at the summertime drivers of the 2019 marine heat wave. And so what he found was over here at the end of the time series, there's a really big jump in the radiative heat flux terms. And then that was really what was responsible for driving the warming, which you can see in the blue line in this boxed region. And advection really played a very minuscule role, if any. Another way you can go about this is to look at kind of the spatial distribution, if you will, of the rate of temperature change in a region. So here's another paper by Qi Chen et al. Looking at the contributions to warming along the Mid-Atlantic Bight during the 2012 marine heat wave. And so what he found here was that, again, the air-sea heat fluxes contributed the greatest to that, to the warming in this region, and it really mapped on spatially to where you had high positive Q fluxes and temperature change, where the advection slightly cooled the region and it was weaker. Okay, so those are some of the ways that we can look at these local processes affecting marine heat waves at a particular location. Now let's think about how climate modes, large scale, what atmospheric blocking or ocean waves influence marine heat waves. And one study that really comes to mind is this paper by Di Lorenzo and Mantua looking at to see if there is a dynamical linkage between this multi-year persistence of anomalies in the Northeast Pacific. So this is their climate hypothesis for the generation and evolution of Northeast Pacific anomalies during the winter of 2014 and 2015 on the right here, and then 2013, 2014, excuse me, on the right, 2014 and 2015 on the left. And so what they found was that there were teleconnection dynamics at play between the extratropics that connected to the tropics and then back into the extratropics that contributed to the multi-year persistence of these anomalies. And so during the winter of 2013 and 2014, those temperature anomalies were generated by a persistent ridge of high pressure over the North Atlantic. And that was influenced or attributed to the North Pacific Oscillation, which is the leading pattern of atmospheric variability. That NPO response is one precursor for El Nino by kind of tickling the meridional modes through the wind evaporation SST feedback. And so that can produce a positive response to El Nino, where it would develop. And El Nino, as you know, changes the atmospheric conditions of the upper troposphere and can send out Rossby waves to the extratropics. And so they found that was the case during the winter 2014 and 2015. Those Rossby waves had an effect on the Aleutian low. So the Aleutian low was deeper and more southeast. And that mechanism can then ignite a positive PDO-like pattern. Now, one of the interesting things that they wanted to know was how are these patterns associated with these marine heat waves going to change in the future? And so what they did was they looked within the CESM large ensemble for at these SST anomalies, and then they computed the EOFs of the sea surface temperature anomalies in the North Pacific during January, February, March. And what they found was that the first two modes, the first two empirical orthogonal functions resembled the patterns they saw in the marine heat wave footprint. And so using the PCs of these EOFs, they were able to see how these patterns will change, the amplitudes will change into the future. Okay, so this is one way to kind of diagnose the evolution of the marine heat wave anomalies and to look at these different patterns. Okay, so this is concluding the introduction here. So I described ways that you characterize marine heat waves and how you can investigate their drivers and their evolution through the use of heat budgets, looking at the different EOFs, or just looking at the maps of the forcing. My project really wanted to kind of take a more unusual approach to look at the evolution. And so for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to introduce a tool that I call OskTrack to essentially identify marine heat wave objects, I call them, and follow them throughout the ocean. It's not a diagnostic for the drivers, but it's a tool to characterize the evolution of SST patterns related to marine heat waves. Okay, so some existing techniques that have been used for object tracking and identification. One is called the watershed method. And so this method, here's an example in David John's paper looking at hail forecasting. So it identifies a local maximum and I think it's like total water column grapple. And from that maximum, it grows the objects outward until they reach some type of area or intensity criteria. Once you have those objects identified, you can then track them in time. And that's what he did in his paper. Another tool that exists out there that I actually used early on and what helped motivate my work was called tempest extremes. And this is a tool that is used to track tropical cyclones. And it has several different kernels it uses to detect points of interest in the data. So whether it's extrema or it's thresholding, it finds closed contours around those points, and then it has a way of stitching it together to track it in time. One thing to note about any of these methods is that there are often parameters involved when you are setting thresholds or different radiuses of the object you're looking for. And those parameters can change the composition of your object set. And so it's important not just to take one set of parameters and run with it, but to do an ensemble approach where you can then look at the sensitivities. Okay, so just some motivation and my personal criteria for developing OskTrack. So the motivation really was just to better understand the spatial temporal evolution of marine heat waves to try to see if there's something that maybe we're missing by our previous and past approaches. And then developing something that we can apply to other phenomena, not just marine heat waves. So the first step that we take in OskTrack is called feature extraction. So we identify candidate points by limiting those that don't satisfy a pre-described set of thresholds. So for example, we use the 90th percentile and only keep points that exceed that 90th percentile. Okay, the second step is object detection. So from those candidate points, we determine if there's a closed contour that exists around a cluster of candidate points. And for that, we use morphological operations, which I'll go into more detail. Using morphological operations, we can then remove those small, or sorry, that's not, after we do the morphological operations, we then remove the small objects that we get from that process. So we can filter it to get rid of heat islands or heat spikes that we're not interested in if we want to look at the really big events. Okay, and the last step is just putting it all together and tracking these objects in time and space, allowing them to branch off or come together is an important feature of OskTrack. And we wanted to produce a new labeled data set that corresponds to different marine heat wave events and the observations that could be used for machine learning purposes. Okay, so now I'm going to walk through the visual description of OskTrack. That was just, words before. So we're using, for this example, sea surface temperature from the OISST data set. Again, it's monthly, average monthly from September 1981 through present. And the first step is to extract those features, like I said. So we want to essentially dissolve away any of the points that don't meet our criteria for a marine heat wave. And so that's set at the 90th percentile. And then we're going to just take that map of the candidate points and feed it into our object detection. And so just to remind you, we've removed, to get the anomalies on the bottom map, we removed the mean, seasonal cycle, and trend, computed over 1982 to 2020. And then we standardized those anomalies by the local standard deviation to account for differences in variance in the ocean. So after we have our features that we're interested in working with, we do object detection. And just as an example, I'm going to pull out this feature in the Northeast Pacific, since we're kind of talking about the blob. Okay, so this is kind of what our input looks like to OskTrack. It's this pixelated image with points of interest that we want to track. So morphological operations is a series of kind of image manipulation where you are, dilating or eroding the image to shape it in a way that you want. And so closing is a series of dilation and erosion. And so you can see now we turn this image that we start with into a binary. So all of the red pixels become 1, all the white becomes 0. And so morphological operation only works on binary images. So as we dilate it, that image kind of swells up. It covers a much bigger area. And then when we erode it, it shrinks away, but it has kind of these wispy features along the edges that we don't really want. And so after closing, we can then reopen it in a way. So then that's followed by an erosion and then dilation. And so the order of dilation, erosion during closing and opening, I didn't make up. That is by definition how they are structured. But the way that we organize it was to get the contours of the marine heat waves that we thought most represented what they should look like from the original image. Okay, so morphological operations, I thought I'd just walk through an example. If people are not familiar with this, the first thing that's really important to remember is that we're working with binary images. So as an example up here on the top, this kind of funky shape here, we're just going to say that is our binary image. So you can imagine everything inside of that shape is a 1, everything outside is a 0. And then we also have to define S, which is a structuring element. And this element can be any type of shape or size you want. For our purposes, we're using a radial looking structuring element where you can change the radius of it to suit kind of tune it, if you will. And what this structuring element, its purpose is to be used as a mask to pass over your image to erode and dilate your binary image. And so for erosion, this mask is slid, it slides across the image at the origin around across your image. So if you plop this structuring element on top of your image and you pass it along, wherever there's a 1 in your structuring element and a 1 in your image, the pixel at the origin where it's overlapping between the structuring element and your image would then become a 0. And so essentially this continues for the entire image. And so essentially what you're doing is you're shrinking that image down, and it removes any of these bridges like you see here and any branches or protrusions. Now dilation is just the opposite. As you're passing that structuring element across your image, if there is a match between the 1s in your structuring element and 1s in your binary image, it'll turn the point at the origin to a 1. And so this will grow your images and fill back those small holes. I know that's a bit complicated, but you just have to remember that erosion shrinks your images, dilation will just kind of expand them. So let's see this on our data. So here is that image that we have after we've extracted our features. Before we do anything, we're going to turn this into a binary, right? So 1s are features, 0s are the background. So closing is a dilation followed by erosion. So you can see now these features are more connected. They're much more pronounced than in our original image. And then erosion shrinks those objects back down to size. After closing, we take that image on the right and we pass it into opening. So we erode it even further and then dilate it. And so now this final dilation 2 is the mask for our original features that we extracted. And so that mask is shown by this green contour. And so it does a pretty good job of capturing these, prominent features around Australia, in the Indonesian seas. And so these are now what we consider our marine heat wave objects. Okay, so after we have all of those closed contour objects in our data set, we can go through and calculate the area of each one. And then what we do is we create a distribution. We look for the 75th percentile of that distribution, and that's what's shown here as this vertical dashed orange line. And we keep all of the objects with an area that's greater than that 75th percentile. And so you can see you're really retaining most of your objects, but what you're doing is you're eliminating these really small, noisy ones that, we're just not that interested in looking at. These might correspond to more eddy-like features. And this choice is completely up to you. And so as of now, there's really two choices that you have to make. One is the size of that structuring element, the shape even, and the other one is what threshold you choose for your size criteria. So once we filter based on the size, now we're left with these static images in our data set. So this is just a rotating view of what objects we defined from our original data set. And so we have over 1,000 marine heat waves since 1982 that we've detected. Our next step is to now connect these in time so that we can look at their trajectories. Okay, so to do multiple object tracking, our rules were that if there are two marine heat waves that are connected either in time or space, then they will be joined, essentially. Their IDs will be joined. And so we define this connectivity element. It's kind of like the structuring element, but now we're in 3D to be able to track these marine heat wave objects in our data set. One of the unique things about this is that it remembers when marine heat wave objects will merge or when they split. And so it keeps track of these events as they break off or come together. Okay, so let's look at an example of a marine heat wave. So this is in the Gulf of Maine in 2012. There was a marine heat wave, and we ran OskTrack on the data and found what object most resembled what we thought would be the 2012 marine heat wave. And so playing this movie forward, you can kind of see this blob kind of evolving in space. So it's really staying put in the Northwest Atlantic. It's not, branching off and going to the tropics or the South Atlantic. So it's a really localized event. We know that it was driven by the atmosphere in this region. And the plot on the bottom right is just showing you the overall footprint of this event in terms of its cumulative intensity. So it gives you an idea of where it was greatest, the impacts were greatest. We can also look at the centroid. So for each object contained in a marine heat wave, so each snapshot in time, we can compute the centroid of that marine heat wave to form more of a trajectory. And so you can see that this marine heat wave really didn't go too far. It was in the same area. It moved kind of towards land and then off the coast there a little bit before coming back. And so it was a pretty localized event. The next one I'm going to show is the blob in the Pacific Ocean. And you'll see that's a much broader scale event. And what's really fascinating is that this marine heat wave, as it evolves, right now you can see that kind of more typical canonical pattern. You see this big El Nino developed. But what's really unique is that we were able to trace that warmth all the way back to the Western South Pacific. You can see it kind of continues off into the South Atlantic. But all of these blobs, as the movie is playing and moving around, they're all connected somehow. It's not to say that the dynamics are connected in any way, but that this pattern of warming progressed in a matter like this. Okay, so here in the bottom right is the cumulative intensity for this event. And so you can see that it really had most of it lingered most in the Northeast Pacific and the El Nino region, but you can see kind of the how far and wide it had an effect here by these lighter colors. And then, if you look at the centroid, it's all over the place, but you can trace it back through the development of the El Nino, kind of like that Di Lorenzo paper. And so it's all makes sense in terms of dynamics, but this is showing you kind of the pathway it took and its evolution. And so we calculate this event to be a 53-month event, which is much, on par, but a little longer than what others described. So after doing that, we can look at all of the marine heat waves that we identify and track and come up with distributions for their intensity. So here, this is the maximum intensity for each marine heat wave identified. And so you can see that it's a bit positively skewed with some intense events, but they kind of congregate on the 3 degrees C. And then if you plot each event as on a scatter plot, you can see comparison between the Gulf of Maine and the blob event in the Northeast Pacific. So the blob was just a lot more intense than the Gulf of Maine event, which was really regional. We can do the same for duration. And so the duration has a very heavy tail. And so a lot of events are more in the 2 to 4 month range, but there are some that like the blob that went on for a very long time that was connected through the tropics. And so that's shown again here on the bottom panel, the difference between the Gulf of Maine and the blob. So the Gulf of Maine was a much shorter event, where the blob really persisted for much longer. And then finally, we can calculate the area. So this is the total area over the lifetime of the event. And so again, it's also heavy-tailed with a lot of, smaller sized marine heat waves, but there are very few really massive marine heat waves. Like we saw the blob. So the blob was quite unusual in its duration and area and even intensity. Okay, so I just want to pop this slide on here because I talked a little bit about choice of parameters. And so the two that we're looking at for OskTrack is the size of that structuring element. So that's the smoothing radius on the y-axis, and then that minimum size percentile, and that's shown on the x-axis. So what this is showing is that when you have larger structuring elements and a larger percentile, your number of marine heat waves is less. Essentially, you have less marine heat waves, and we think that's probably because you have less marine heat waves, but they're also really big marine heat waves because that structuring element is connecting more of the features that we extracted from it. Duration also, it increases as you increase your structuring element, but it actually isn't as linear because when you increase your percentile, you just don't have as large of a population size to calculate the duration. So you see that it kind of peaks more at a smaller area threshold. And so we did this to look at the sensitivity of the parameters, and it actually helped us kind of land on the ones that we used to look at these marine heat waves. And then we also conduct this study using different thresholds for marine heat waves and different resolutions of data set. Okay, so what new insights does OskTrack reveal about marine heat waves? Well, from what I've shown you, there's really 2 different types of marine heat wave patterns. So there's these localized events that kind of grow and decay in the same general location. So that is most typical of the Gulf of Maine marine heat wave. And then there's these really large, dynamically linked marine heat waves that can move connected through the tropics. And that was the blob was an example of that type of marine heat wave. So these globally tropical connected marine heat waves, they tend to last longer. And then I also showed how these marine heat waves can split and merge and come back together. Okay, so why should you use OskTrack? Well, I think that we've overcome some limitations characterizing the complex spatial connectivity and temporal behavior of marine heat waves by coming up with this tracker. We're not just now relying on a single point or an averaged analysis over some domain. We're kind of letting the anomalies themselves and move around. This potentially provides a catalog for observing heat waves that others use. And you can apply OskTrack to other phenomenon. It's not just limited to extremes in temperature, but you could look at oxygen minimum zones, which is work that that I might be doing next. And then looking at harmful algal blooms, or even trying to track the temperature anomalies related to El Nino around the Pacific. This is my last slide here before questions. And I just wanted to pop this up here in case anyone is interested in using OskTrack or wants to get involved. That would be great if you tried OskTrack, if you found something that wasn't working and submitted an issue on the GitHub page or even improved it, would be even better. Or you can email me directly and I can help set you up. There's going to be another talk related to OskTrack at SciPy in July, and that will be more demo technically based. So if you're interested in learning more, encourage you to go to SciPy.
Thanks so much, Hillary, for a really nice talk. Thanks for describing your work on OskTrack. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, which is great. So as always, if you have questions for Hillary, you can type them in the chat and I'll read them out loud, or you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom and ask your question out loud. I guess I'll start with a question I had, which you sort of answered at the end, which is using it for other phenomena. And so I was just wondering if you had even some initial thoughts on how the process might be different when you're looking at things like algal blooms or other types of extreme events.
Yeah, so it really depends on the data set you have, I think. So what the resolution is, both spatially and temporally, what I think having some a priori knowledge of the phenomenon you're trying to characterize is very helpful. So for me, with marine heat waves, I knew I wanted to characterize these really the big events, not I didn't want to look at eddies or like smaller marine heat waves. And so having an idea of what you're looking for is helpful, and that will help inform your decisions of the parameters to choose. So the things like the structuring element and your size criteria. And so I think there's just a lot of playing around you can do with those criteria to adjust it to kind of, you tune it to see if what you're getting out looks to the phenomenon you're trying to identify and track. But I could see using it, and eventually it doesn't necessarily work on satellite data currently, but there's many ways for it to expand to that level as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought those sensitivity plots were also really interesting, where you talked about the different parameter choices. Looks like we have a question from Bill Large. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, there's a lot of applications for this sort of stuff, and you had many instances to use thresholds to make decisions, and you use 90% kind of things. Is there any literature or a lot of use where it's actually different criteria to get out of a characterization than to go in? So it might be hard to get in, but it's easier to stay. You know what I mean?
Well, I don't. So what do you mean?
Well, like you might say, I need a 90th percentile to be characterized, but if I'm already characterized, I might have to get, maybe I'll be okay with 80%. It's easier to get in, it's hard to get in, but it's easier to stay. You don't run across that idea at all? I don't know. That's my question.
Hillary, are you still with us? Might have some connection issues. Hang on a second.
Yeah, it wasn't
Right.
that
I'm not
hard.
sure I understand completely. You're also up. Yeah, I mean, you can. Yes. Okay.
Hillary,
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you could try turning off your video to maybe help with the bandwidth.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
that's okay. That's okay.
Convenient
Yeah, we
time
didn't
for
quite hear the
audio to
answer
cut
there.
out. I actually heard the beginning part of the question, and I think it was somewhere like once you've set your threshold for the marine heat wave, say at 90 percentile, it was something related to what you could get out of it.
No, it was
that-
simple. If say it's 90%, you say this point is now classified as a heat wave point. And I thought
Right.
everything you did, it had to have that same threshold to stay. But there might be applications where you say, well,
Yeah.
once I'm in a
Right.
state, it's hard to get into the state, but it's easier to stay. That was the way. And I'm just wondering if you run across that idea or used it or thought about it.
No, I haven't. But it could be pretty valuable. Yeah. How easy is it for you to stay above that threshold for that marine heat wave? I'd have to think about it a little more. Yeah. And also too, like with the morphological operations, because it's adding and removing different pixels around the perimeter of the objects, it could potentially be adding pixels that didn't meet your criteria to begin with.
Yeah, that's what it
so
seemed. It might be doing some of this idea. I just wasn't quite quick enough to pick it up, but it looked like it was doing something like that. Yeah, well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
A question from Rohini, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Hillary, thanks a lot for this introducing this tool. And we had been working also on similar kind of tool but for different application like a drought identification, for example, to track the space-time evolution of the drought, and the similar sort of object and similar sort of issues arises. And you clearly identified or said like, okay, the choice of the parameter of splitting and merging also makes big differences removal. And we should be very cautious about its use in any kind of trend analysis. For example, how many number of events that could increase in future, that would very much depends on what parameter that we fix it in this removal. One thing I was just wondering about, once you have the identification of the clusters, then how are you splitting and joining this cluster to tell that this is a one event? Do you use some kind of minimum area threshold? Like two clusters are joined to a one event. So in the big blob, there were many clusters that were separately evolving, and they could have their own evolution. So
yep. Yeah.
How
so
do you identify that belongs to one event?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We run the tracking essentially forward and backwards along the data set. And so it has a way of remembering which objects have merged or split together. And so, yeah, quite simply, you're tracking forward and you're tracking backwards, and then you're matching those together. Yeah.
And you don't have any criteria for a minimum overlapping, or just it's
Nope.
Okay.
They just touch on the spatially or temporally. Yeah. Tempest extremes now, they do have an overlap criteria that you can set. It's like % overlap. And so you can
Right.
set that to be whatever you'd like.
I had another one, but I would come back once if everybody else is finished. So I have another question, just a quick clarification.
All right, yeah, I'm going to read a question in the chat from Alice, and then maybe we'll bounce back to you.
Thank you.
So Alice asks, early on, you had a map of marine heat wave intensity and duration. I noticed in the western boundary currents, the intensity was relatively high, but the duration was a lot shorter than in the Pacific. Do you know why this is the case?
Yeah, I can share my screen maybe. Do this. All right, so I think it's this figure here. Yeah, so the intensity. Okay, yeah, so the question was the intensity seems really intense in the western boundary currents, but not so in the duration, right? Well, those are that's a good question, but I think that's where your frontal boundaries are. And so those marine heat waves, any kind of perturbation in that position of that current can create a really intense marine heat wave, but they're very energetic regions where, you know, things like eddies and things like that can move through pretty quickly. And so the duration is not as high in those regions. That's my understanding of it. I'm not sure, like when we did the literature review, there were not a lot of examples of marine heat waves in the western boundary. That was actually kind of a gap. And so, yeah, I think it would be interesting for someone to do some kind of analysis looking at eddies and detected marine heat waves and their co-occurrence.
Okay, yeah, she says, thanks, that makes sense. Let's go back to Rohini. I don't see any other questions, so let's take one last question from you, and then we'll wrap up.
So, thanks. Hilary, if I understood it, in one of your slides, you said that, okay, well, you identify the anomaly with respect to removing the seasonal cycle, and then you remove the trend. Did I got it right? That you remove the trend from before calculating the 90th percent. And what was the basic idea of trend? Sorry.
Yeah. Yep. So we removed the trends with the seasonal cycle. Essentially, so you're detrending the data, and then you compute the 90th percentile on that detrended data. So we wanted to avoid the situation where you would just have a global marine heat wave because of the trend, essentially, in this tracking. It wouldn't quite work. So it's
basically guy got it. I got it. Like it's because of the trend, so that global warming effect is not reflected in your analysis. So could I say that it is that you want to only look the natural variability and not the systematic trend? Hello?
Did you catch that, Hilary?
Yeah, I think that you've cut out a little bit. Yeah, so we are not looking at the trend. It's more of the variability of the natural variability of the marine heat waves.
Right. That is why your data set does not have also the trend. When I was looking at a lot of frequencies were almost like a stable around 3 to 4, right?
Yep. Right. That's why.
Yeah.
Yep.
I got. That would mean that we would underestimate a little bit the severity of the recent events. But that always depends on the question that we want to answer.
Yeah, that's true. But I also think even when we remove the trend, that the blob in the Northeast Pacific really still stood out to be quite unusual. And so it's maybe not as important to keep in if you're still able to capture these events.
Yeah,
it does
thanks.
depend on the
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, it's got it. Oh, thanks.
I do see that Peter, you have your hand up. Do you have a quick question before we conclude?
Yes, thank you. Very nice talk, very clear. So my question is, can OskTrack be used to try and figure out the dynamics of why these things arise and then dissipate, such as, whether it's heat flux or advection?
Yeah, so OskTrack cannot, but and that once you have those labels, those mask of where that with atmospheric variability in that area. It's trying to identify experiencing heat wave. It doesn't diagnose any of the drivers quite yet.
Sorry, Hillary, that was a little bit garbled on your end. I turned your video off. Do you want to just quickly review the answer?
Sure. Yep. So OskTrack does not diagnose drivers, but it is an additional data set that could be used as a mask to then go back and look at some of the other processes going on in those regions that could be contributing to the marine heat wave in that location.
Oh, thanks. And thanks, Peter, for the question. I had a similar question. So I think we're a little bit over. I think we'll conclude. But thanks again, Hillary, for a really nice talk and introducing us to your work. Next week, we will hear from Danielle Tuma from the University of California, Santa Barbara. So hope to see you then.